Mrs. Sterling, you have exactly 1 minute to gather your belongings and leave the premises before I call security. Those words still echo in my mind every single day, but now they make me smile instead of cry. The woman who delivered that ultimatum with such vicious satisfaction? She's currently scrubbing floors in the very mansion she tried to steal from me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, there's something beautiful about watching karma work its magic. When people show you exactly who they are through their cruelty, through their hatred, through their absolute certainty that they're better than you, well, that's when the universe starts keeping score. And let me tell you, the universe has one hell of a memory. Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well today. Whether you're watching from your cozy living room, taking a break at work, or maybe dealing with some rainy weather like we had here yesterday, I'm glad you're here with me. Before we dive into this story, please make sure to hit that like button if emotional justice stories speak to your soul, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. My name is Amara Sterling, and this is the story of how I went from a broken woman clutching $12 and 3 crying babies to the owner of a $50 million empire. This is about the day I discovered that the man I loved had orchestrated the most beautiful revenge from beyond the grave, and how his racist family learned that underestimating a black mother is the costliest mistake you can ever make. Picture this. Me, standing in a marble foyer bigger than most people's entire homes, holding my 3-year-old triplets while my mother-in-law literally counted out 12 crumpled dollar bills into my palm like I was some street beggar. The lawyers, the family members, even the housekeeping staff, everyone was laughing. Actually laughing. At a widow. At 3 little boys who had just lost their father. But let me start from the beginning because you need to understand how deep this betrayal cut and how perfect the revenge turned out to be. I was 24 when I met James Sterling. Not the usual age for fairy tales, but that's exactly what it felt like. I was working 2 jobs. Morning shift at a coffee shop near the university, evening shift at a bookstore, just trying to make ends meet while finishing my education degree. James was this quiet, thoughtful customer who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordered the same thing, always left generous tips, and always had a genuine smile that reached his eyes. For months, our relationship was built on small conversations. He'd ask about my day, I'd recommend books, we'd chat about everything from politics to poetry. I had no idea his last name was Sterling, as in Sterling Industries, Sterling Real Estate, Sterling practically owns half the state. To me, he was just James who drove a modest sedan and wore clothes that weren't flashy, but were clearly well-made. When he finally asked me out, I said yes because he made me laugh. Because he listened when I talked about my dreams of teaching, about wanting to make a difference in kids' lives. Because when I mentioned struggling to afford textbooks, he didn't offer money. He offered to study with me, said he'd enjoy brushing up on education theory. I believed in love. I believed in the goodness of people. I believed that when you give someone your whole heart, they protect it. I believed that family meant acceptance, support, unconditional love. I believed that marriage was a partnership where 2 people built something beautiful together, where they protected each other against the world. Most of all, I believed that James loved me enough to shield me from anything that could hurt me. I was so incredibly wrong about that last part. And yet, somehow, I was also more right than I ever could have imagined. But let me tell you what happened when his family first met me. The first time James brought me home to meet his family, I spent 3 hours getting ready. I remember standing in front of my tiny apartment mirror, trying on the one nice dress I owned, a simple black number I'd bought for job interviews. James had been vague about his family, just saying they were traditional and set in their ways, which I interpreted as conservative. I figured I could handle conservative. What I couldn't handle was walking into a mansion that looked like something from a historical documentary and realizing my boyfriend was literally American royalty. James picked me up in his usual sedan, but when we pulled through gates that probably cost more than my annual salary, past manicured gardens that stretched for acres, toward a house that could fit my entire apartment building inside it twice over. I felt my stomach drop to my shoes. "James," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What exactly does your family do?" He reached over and squeezed my hand. "They own some businesses. Real estate, mostly. Don't let it intimidate you, Amara. You're worth 10 of them." That should have been my first red flag. Not the wealth, the fact that he said I was worth 10 of them. Like he already knew they were going to treat me badly. But I was 24 and in love, so I squeezed his hand back and said, "I'm sure they're lovely." The door was answered by a woman who could have stepped out of a fashion magazine from the 1950s. Perfect blonde hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture, and eyes that scanned me from head to toe in about 2 seconds flat. Her smile never faltered, but it never reached her eyes either. "You must be Amanda," she said, extending one perfectly manicured hand. "Amara," I corrected gently. "Of course. I'm Victoria Sterling, James's mother. Please come in." The house was a museum. Not a home, a museum. Everything was white or cream or gold. Everything was antique and probably worth more than most people's cars. I was afraid to touch anything, afraid to breathe too hard, afraid my very presence might somehow damage something priceless. James's father, Richard Sterling, was exactly what you'd picture when you think old money patriarch. Tall, silver-haired, commanding presence, handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds and conveyed absolutely nothing warm. His brothers were carbon copies, same expensive haircuts, same expensive watches, same way of looking at me like I was an interesting specimen they'd found under a microscope. But it was James's sister Catherine who delivered the first real blow. "So, Amara," she said during dinner, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "James tells us you're studying to be a teacher. How public service-oriented of you." The way she said public service made it sound like I'd told her I cleaned sewers for a living. "I love working with children," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Education is so important for breaking cycles of poverty and inequality." The silence that followed could have cut glass. Richard Sterling cleared his throat. "Admirable sentiment," he said in a tone that suggested he found it anything but admirable, though I imagine the financial rewards are rather limited. James's jaw tightened. "Not everyone measures success in dollar signs, Dad." "No," Victoria chimed in smoothly, "but dollar signs do tend to measure stability, security, the ability to provide for a family." They were talking about me like I wasn't sitting right there, like I was some charity case James had picked up that they needed to evaluate for worthiness. But the worst part? I tried so hard to win them over. Over the next 6 months, as James and I got more serious, I bent over backwards to fit into their world. I let Victoria take me shopping for appropriate clothes, spending money I didn't have on outfits that felt like costumes. I learned which fork to use for which course, how to make small talk about art and wine and other things I knew nothing about. I smiled politely when Catherine made her little comments about my hair, my accent, my background. James proposed on a Tuesday night in my apartment, not in some grand romantic gesture at a fancy restaurant, but while we were grading papers together on my couch. He said he loved how dedicated I was to my students, how I made him want to be a better person, how he couldn't imagine building a life with anyone else. "I want to give you everything," he whispered, sliding the ring onto my finger. It wasn't massive or flashy, but it was perfect. "I want to protect you from anything that could ever hurt you." I should have asked what he thought might hurt me. I should have pushed him to explain why his family's acceptance felt so conditional, why he sometimes looked worried when I mentioned wedding plans, why he insisted we have such a long engagement. Instead, I threw myself into becoming the daughter-in-law they wanted. I changed my major from elementary education to business, thinking it would make them respect me more. I spent hours researching etiquette, practicing conversation topics that would interest them, learning about their social circle. When Victoria suggested I consider modernizing my appearance, I let her take me to her stylist. When Richard mentioned that Sterling wives traditionally handled certain charitable obligations, I volunteered for every committee he suggested. When Catherine casually mentioned that the family had certain expectations about prenups, I agreed without question. James fought me on the prenup. He said it wasn't necessary, that his family was being ridiculous, that I shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone. But I insisted. I wanted them to know I wasn't after their money, that I loved James for who he was, not what he had. So I signed papers I barely read, trusting that the man I loved would never let anything happen to me. The wedding was everything Victoria wanted, and nothing I had dreamed of. 300 guests I'd never met, flowers that cost more than my parents' mortgage, a dress that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. My family looked completely out of place among the Sterling social circle, and I spent the entire reception feeling like an actress who had forgotten her lines. But James looked at me like I was the only person in the room. During our first dance, he whispered, "I know this isn't what you wanted. After we're married, it'll be different. It'll be just us." I believed him. When he bought us a house in an exclusive neighborhood, I believed it was because he wanted to give me a beautiful home. When he insisted I quit my teaching job because Sterling wives don't work, I believed it was because he wanted to take care of me. When the babies came, 3 perfect boys at once, and his family's comments about good breeding and strong genes made my skin crawl, I believed James when he said they'd come around. For 3 years, I believed that love was enough. That eventually his family would see what he saw in me. That the little comments, the subtle exclusions, the way they spoke to me like I was hired help at family gatherings, all of that would fade once they realized I wasn't going anywhere. Then James died. Car accident on a rainy Thursday night, coming home from a business dinner. One moment, I was a wife and mother living in a beautiful house with a man who adored me, and the next moment, I was a widow with 3 toddlers and no idea how I was going to survive. That's when I learned the difference between being tolerated and being accepted. The morning after the funeral, Victoria appeared at my door with 2 large men in suits. "Amara, dear," she said, that same false smile from our first meeting. "We need to discuss your living situation." "Your living situation," I repeated, still in my funeral dress from the day before, still feeling like I was moving through thick fog. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" The 2 men behind Victoria weren't just large, they were clearly security. Professional. The kind of people you hire when you expect resistance. "Well, this house belongs to the Sterling Family Trust," Victoria continued, stepping past me into my foyer like she owned the place. Which apparently she did. James was living here as a beneficiary, but now that he's gone, his wife and children live here, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "This is our home, Victoria. These are your grandchildren's home." She looked around the living room where my boys' toys were scattered, where their artwork hung on the refrigerator, where every piece of furniture held memories of the life James and I had built together. "The children are Sterling's, of course. That will never change. But you, dear?" She turned back to me with that practiced smile. "You're not family anymore." "Not really." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Not family? I'm their mother. I was James's wife. You were James's wife. Past tense. And I'm afraid the prenup you signed was quite specific about what happens in the event of his death." I had read that prenup. I remembered signing it, remembered telling James it was fine because I didn't care about money, I only cared about him. But the document had been 30 pages of legal language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. "The children can visit, naturally," Victoria continued. "We'll arrange reasonable custody. But this house, the cars, the accounts, all of that reverts to the family trust." "Visit?" My voice cracked. "Visit their own home? These are James's sons. These are Sterling heirs," Richard said, appearing in the doorway. He'd let himself in through the back door, like he owned the place. Which apparently he did. "And they'll be raised with proper values, proper education, proper influences. The meaning was crystal clear.
Not raised by me.
You can't take my children, I whispered. We're not taking anyone, Catherine said, gliding in behind her father. The whole family was here now, circling like vultures. We're simply ensuring the boys have access to their birthright. Their legacy. Their legacy is their father's love for their mother, I said, my voice getting stronger. Their legacy is the home we built together, the family we created. Richard laughed. Actually laughed. My dear girl, their legacy is Sterling Industries. Sterling Real Estate. Sterling Holdings. Generations of wealth and influence that you couldn't possibly understand or appreciate. I understand that my husband loved me. I understand that he wanted us to be a family. James was young, Victoria said dismissively. He made impulsive decisions. Romantic decisions. But we're here to clean up the mess.
The mess.
They were calling my marriage, my children, my entire life, a mess. Get out, I said quietly. I beg your pardon? Get out of my house.
Right now.
Victoria's smile finally faltered. Amara, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. You have no income, no savings, no family wealth to fall back on. You're a single mother with 3 small children and no marketable skills. I have a teaching degree, which you've never used professionally, which means you have no experience, no references, no professional network. She paused, letting that sink in. We're offering you a reasonable alternative. A monthly allowance in exchange for shared custody. The boys would split their time between your apartment and our estate, ensuring they receive proper education and social connections. Shared custody of my own children? It's better than the alternative, Richard said coldly. I wanted to ask what the alternative was, but something in his tone told me I didn't want to know. The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal papers, phone calls, and conversations with lawyers who all seemed to work for the Sterling family. Every door I knocked on, every legal aid office I contacted, every free consultation I scheduled, somehow, they all led back to the same message. I had signed my rights away. The prenup wasn't just about money. It was about everything. Custody, property, even my right to use the Sterling name. James had never explained any of it to me, had probably never read the fine print himself. His family's lawyers had crafted a document that would strip me of everything the moment James died, and I had signed it with a smile because I trusted the man I loved. But the cruelest part was watching how they treated my boys during this nightmare. When the family came to visit, they showered Marcus, David, and Jonathan with expensive toys and promises of trips to Disney World, private schools, summer camps with their cousins. They spoke to them in loving voices, calling them Sterling princes and future leaders. Then they turned to me, with ice in their eyes. Mama, why do Grandma Victoria and Grandpa Richard look angry when they talk to you? Marcus asked one night. He was always the most perceptive of my 3. They're just sad about Daddy, I told him, which was both true and completely inadequate. But they don't look sad. They look mean. Out of the mouths of babes. The morning I had to pack our belongings, Victoria arrived early with a moving truck and a team of people who sorted through our things like we were having an estate sale. The art stays, obviously. James bought those pieces for the house, Catherine announced, directing workers to remove paintings from our walls. The furniture was selected specifically for the space, so it stays as well. I watched them strip away everything James and I had chosen together. The coffee table where we'd had breakfast on lazy Sunday mornings. The couch where he'd read bedtime stories to the boys. The dining room set where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. The jewelry, of course, was Sterling family pieces on loan, Victoria said, holding out her hand expectantly. I had to remove my wedding ring, my anniversary gifts, even a necklace James had given me for my birthday. They'd kept receipts for everything, proof that it all belonged to them. Mama, why are they taking Daddy's pictures? David asked, watching workers remove family photos from the mantelpiece. Those are Sterling family photos, sweetheart, Victoria explained in her sugar-sweet voice. They belong with the Sterling family. Even the pictures. They were taking even the pictures. We left that house with 7 suitcases, a box of the boys' toys, and my broken heart. I had managed to save $3,000 from the household account before they froze everything else. Money I'd scraped together from grocery budgets and small purchases, thinking I was being responsible. It was all I had left. The apartment I could afford was a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that made my old life feel like a fairy tale. The boys had to share a mattress on the living room floor, while I slept on a couch that came with the furnished place. The walls were thin enough that we could hear our neighbors' arguments, and the building smelled like old cooking grease and despair. But the worst part was watching my 3-year-olds try to understand why their whole world had disappeared overnight. "When are we going home, Mama?" Jonathan asked every single day. "This is home now, baby." "But where's Daddy's room? Where are my trucks?" How do you explain to a toddler that his grandmother gave away his toys because they were too expensive for his new life? How do you tell a 3-year-old that the people who claim to love him most have decided his mother isn't good enough to raise him? The Sterling family's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Rebecca Morrison, called 2 weeks after we'd moved out. "Mrs. Sterling, we need to schedule the will reading." "Finally. When can we meet?" "Tomorrow morning at 10. I'll send a car." The car turned out to be a black sedan with a driver who treated me like I might contaminate his upholstery. He drove me to the Sterling family's law firm, a building that screamed old money and established power, where everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. The conference room was bigger than my new apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, crystal water glasses sat at each place setting, and the massive mahogany table could have seated 20 people comfortably. The Sterling family was already assembled. Victoria, Richard, Catherine, James's brothers Michael and David Sr., various cousins and extended family members I barely recognized. They all turned when I entered, and the silence was deafening. "Amara," Victoria said with false warmth, "please sit down." The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, separated from everyone else like I was a defendant facing trial. Rebecca Morrison stood at the head of the table with a thick folder and reading glasses that made her look like a bird of prey. "We're here for the reading of James Michael Sterling's last will and testament," she began formally. "As you know, Mr. Sterling died unexpectedly at the age of 29, leaving behind his wife Amara and 3 minor children." She opened the folder and began reading. Trust funds for the boys, substantial ones that would ensure their education and future. The house we'd lived in went to Michael Sterling. James's shares in Sterling Industries were distributed among family members. His cars, his personal effects, his investment accounts, all carefully allocated to various relatives. With each item, the family members nodded approvingly or murmured quiet thanks. I sat frozen, waiting for my name to be called, waiting to hear what James had left for the woman he'd promised to protect. And finally, Rebecca said, "To my beloved wife Amara, I leave the sum of $12 and the property located at 1247 Maple Creek Road." Silence. Then Catherine snorted. Actually snorted.
$12.
Victoria repeated, her voice dripping with amusement. 12 whole dollars? "And some cabin in the middle of nowhere," Michael added, shuffling through papers. "Looks like it's about to fall down according to the property assessment." The laughter started small. A chuckle from one of the cousins. A snicker from David Sr., then it spread around the table like wildfire until the entire Sterling family was laughing at me. Laughing at the woman who had just buried her husband. Laughing at the mother of their grandchildren and nephews. "Well," Richard said, wiping his eyes, "I suppose that tells us exactly what James really thought about his marriage." $12, Catherine repeated through her giggles. "That won't even cover parking downtown." "Maybe the cabin has sentimental value," Victoria said mockingly. "Didn't James have some old family property out in the sticks? Probably where the farm workers used to live." More laughter. Louder now. mean-spirited and cruel, and aimed directly at my breaking heart. Rebecca Morrison set a small envelope on the table in front of me. Inside were 12 wrinkled dollar bills, actual cash, like James had emptied his wallet before he died, and a deed to property I'd never heard of. "That concludes the reading," Rebecca announced. "Mrs. Sterling, you'll need to vacate any Sterling properties within 30 days, surrender any Sterling credit cards or accounts, and arrange for supervised visitation with the children through our family court liaison." I stood up on shaking legs, clutching the envelope with my $12 inheritance, while an entire family continued laughing at my devastation. "Oh, Amara," Victoria called as I reached the door. "When you're ready to discuss reasonable custody arrangements, do give us a call. We're not unreasonable people." Reasonable people. They had stripped me of my home, my identity, my security, and my children's father's legacy, and they thought they were being reasonable. I walked out of that building with $12 and a deed to property I'd never seen, listening to their laughter echo down the marble hallway behind me. That night, I fed my boys mac and cheese from a box using my last few dollars while they asked again when we were going home. I stared at the deed in the dim lamplight of our tiny apartment, reading the address over and over. 1247 Maple Creek Road. In the morning, I thought I'd find a way to get there. Maybe I could sell whatever ramshackle cabin James had left me, use the money to hire a real lawyer, fight for some dignity in this nightmare. I had no idea I was holding the key to the greatest revenge story ever written. But James had known. Even in death, James had known exactly what he was doing. The lawyer's business card felt like sandpaper between my fingers as I sat in my car outside the legal aid office, watching my $12 stretch into impossibility. It had been 2 days since the will reading, and I'd spent those 48 hours living in a strange bubble of disbelief and growing panic. Rebecca Morrison had been crystal clear during our follow-up phone call that morning. "Mrs. Sterling, the will is ironclad. Your husband left you exactly what he intended to leave you. If you're struggling financially, I suggest you contact social services." Social services. For the Sterling grandchildren. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't destroying my life. I'd visited 3 legal aid offices in 2 days, and the story was always the same. The moment I mentioned the Sterling name, faces changed. Appointments got mysteriously canceled. Lawyers who had seemed eager to help suddenly discovered conflicts of interest. "Ma'am," the receptionist at the final office had explained with genuine sympathy, "the Sterling family donates heavily to legal aid programs throughout the state. We simply can't take a case against them. It would be complicated." Complicated. That seemed to be everyone's favorite word when it came to fighting the Sterling family. So there I sat in my car, which would probably be repossessed within the month since it was apparently also part of the Sterling family trust, staring at a deed to property I couldn't afford to visit and watching my phone buzz with increasingly urgent messages. The first text was from Victoria. "Amara, dear, we really must discuss the boys' schooling situation. Private kindergarten applications are due soon." The second was from my landlord. "Rent is due tomorrow. No exceptions." The third was from the daycare. "Payment is past due. Children cannot return until account is current." I had $43 left after buying groceries yesterday. Rent was $800. Daycare was another $400 a week. Even if I found a job immediately, who's going to hire a woman with no recent work experience, no references, and 3 children who needed constant care? The boys were inside the apartment right now with Mrs. Chun, the elderly neighbor who had offered to watch them for free after hearing them crying through the walls. She was probably the only person in the world showing us genuine kindness, and I couldn't even afford to pay her properly.
My phone rang. Victoria Sterling.
"Amara, we need to talk."
I'm listening.
"Not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch? Say, the country club in an hour?" The country club where I'd attended exactly 3 functions as James's wife, where I'd felt like an exhibit every single time. "Victoria, I can't afford." My treat, naturally. We have a proposition that might solve everyone's problems.
A proposition.
From the woman who had laughed at my $12 inheritance. An hour later, I sat across from Victoria Sterling in the dining room where James had proposed to me in front of his entire family 3 years earlier. She looked perfectly composed in her Chanel suit and pearls, while I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral because it was the nicest thing I owned. "You look tired, dear," she observed, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. 3-year-old triplets tend to have that effect.
Imagine.
Which brings me to our discussion. She dabbed her lips with the cloth napkin. Richard and I have been talking with the boys' trust fund managers. They're concerned about the children's current living situation. What about their living situation? Well, the neighborhood you've chosen isn't exactly appropriate for Sterling heirs. The schools in that district have such poor test scores. And I understand you're having some financial difficulties. I didn't ask how she knew about my financial difficulties. The Sterling family seemed to know everything. The boys are fine, Victoria. They're safe. They're loved there. They're sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a 1-bedroom apartment in a building with a documented drug problem. The food turned to ash in my mouth. How do you know that? Amara, these are our grandchildren. Of course we're going to ensure their welfare. She leaned forward with what might have been genuine concern, if I didn't know better. We want to help. What kind of help? Full custody. The words hit me like ice water. Absolutely not. Hear me out. The boys would live with Richard and me during the week. Proper schools, proper nutrition, proper supervision. You could have them on weekends, holidays. You'd have time to get back on your feet, find employment, establish some stability. I am their mother. Of course you are. And you'll always be their mother. But darling, love isn't enough to raise children properly. They need security, opportunity, connections that will serve them throughout their lives. They need their mother. Victoria's mask slipped just slightly. Their mother can't even afford to feed them properly. The accusation stung because it was becoming true. I'd been stretching every meal, buying the cheapest everything, watching my boys ask for seconds when there weren't any seconds to give. This arrangement would be temporary, she continued smoothly. Just until you establish yourself professionally. We'd even provide a modest living allowance to help with your expenses. How modest? $2,000 a month. $2,000. It was more money than I'd seen in weeks, enough to afford a decent apartment, enough to breathe. But it came with a price I couldn't pay. I won't sign away my children. You wouldn't be signing them away. You'd be ensuring their future. Victoria's voice took on that edge I remembered from family gatherings. Amara, be realistic. What can you offer them? A mother who works minimum wage jobs? A life of struggle and limitation? Or grandparents who can provide the best of everything? She opened her purse and pulled out a folder. These are the private schools we're considering. Here's the summer camp program with their cousins. Here's the college fund projections. Page after page of opportunities my boys could have. Elite education, travel, connections that would open doors I couldn't even imagine. Everything I wanted for them, but could never provide. And this, she said, sliding a final paper across the table, is what happens if you refuse. It was a petition for emergency custody, filed that morning, citing inadequate housing, financial instability, and emotional distress of the children. You filed for custody? Today. As a precaution. The family court hearing is scheduled for next week. Of course, if we reach an agreement, we could withdraw the petition. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice. Voluntary shared custody with generous terms, or court-ordered custody with much less favorable arrangements. My hands were shaking as I read the legal papers. They had documented everything: our address, the condition of our building, my employment status, even grocery receipts showing cheap meals and generic brands. How did you get all this information? Private investigators, dear. We had to ensure the children's safety. Private investigators. They'd been watching us, following us, documenting our poverty like evidence in a criminal case. I need time to think. Of course. But Amara? Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. The hearing is Tuesday. That's 5 days. I'd hate for this to get unpleasant. I drove home in a daze, those legal papers burning in my passenger seat. When I walked into our tiny apartment, Mrs. Chun was reading to the boys from a library book, their little faces bright with attention.
Nana.
Marcus jumped up and wrapped his arms around my legs. Mrs. Chun was telling us about dragons. Not dragons, sweetheart. Lions. The brave lion who protected his family. Like Daddy protected us? The innocent question broke something inside me. James had tried to protect us, but he was gone. And now his family was using his absence to destroy everything he'd loved. That evening, after the boys were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. No matter how I arranged the numbers, they didn't work. Even with a full-time job, I couldn't afford childcare for 3 children and still pay rent. Without a degree in something marketable, the highest-paying job I could get was maybe $12 an hour. That was $2,000 a month before taxes, not enough to survive. But Victoria's offer would mean losing my children 5 days a week. Watching them adapt to a life where I was just the weekend parent, where their real life happened in the Sterling mansion with their Sterling grandparents who could give them everything I couldn't. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Saw you at the club today. Hope Mother's proposal makes sense. The boys need stability. You want what's best for them, don't you? Another text, this one from Michael. Kids grow up fast. Don't let pride rob them of opportunities. They were coordinating, pressuring me from all sides, making sure I understood that resistance was futile. But the cruelest pressure came from my own children. Mama, why don't we have toys like at Grandma's house? David asked the next morning. We have toys, baby. Look, your truck is right here. But it's broken. And Grandma Victoria says they have a whole room just for toys. With video games and everything. Grandma Victoria says a lot of things. She says if we lived with them, we could have our own horses. Horses. Of course they had promised my 3-year-old's horses. And she says we could go to the same school as our cousins, and we could have play dates every day instead of just sometimes. Every promise was designed to show my children what they were missing by staying with me. Every visit to the Sterling estate was calculated to make our apartment feel smaller, our life feel insufficient. That afternoon, Rebecca Morrison called with another bombshell. Mrs. Sterling, there's been a development regarding your housing situation. What kind of development? The Sterling family has purchased your apartment building. The words didn't compute. They bought my building? Closing was this morning. As the new owners, they're implementing some immediate improvements. Rent for your unit will be increasing to market rate, $2,400 per month, effective immediately. $2,400 for a 1-bedroom apartment in a building that smelled like cigarettes and despair. That's 3 times what I'm paying now. Market rate for that area has increased significantly. However, I understand the new owners might be willing to work with existing tenants who have special circumstances. Special circumstances. They meant if I gave them my children. How long do I have? New lease terms take effect Monday. That's 4 days. 4 days to find a new apartment with no money and no credit. 4 days before the custody hearing. They had engineered this perfectly. Financial crisis and legal crisis hitting simultaneously, forcing me to choose between homelessness and surrender. That weekend, the boys had their scheduled visit with the Sterling family. Victoria picked them up in a car that cost more than most people's houses, and they came back chattering about the pool, the game room, the chef who made them personalized pizzas. Grandpa Richard says we're going to learn to play tennis, Jonathan announced. And Aunt Catherine says we can have a sleepover next week with our cousins. That sounds fun, baby. Why don't you ever come to Grandma's house, Mama? Because they don't want me there, I thought. Because they've made it clear that I'm not family, not welcome, not worthy of their world. Mama's just busy with grown-up things. Grandma Victoria says you could come if you wanted to. She says you just have to ask nicely. Ask nicely. For permission to see my own children in their new life. Monday morning, I found an eviction notice taped to my door. Tuesday was the custody hearing. I had nowhere to live, no money for a lawyer, and 3 children who were being systematically turned against the life I could provide them. I sat on that second-hand couch in that apartment I could no longer afford, holding the deed to some property I'd never seen, and finally understood what James's family had done. They hadn't just taken everything from me, they had orchestrated a complete destruction of my ability to be a mother. The custody papers, the rent increase, the private investigators, the promises to my children, it was all coordinated. All designed to force me into a corner where surrender looked like the only reasonable option. But that deed in my hands represented something else. Some final gesture from the man who had promised to protect me. Maybe the property was worthless. Maybe it was just a ramshackle cabin in the middle of nowhere. But it was something they couldn't take from me. Something James had specifically, intentionally left for me alone. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt curious. On Tuesday morning, instead of showing up for the custody hearing I couldn't afford to fight, I used my last tank of gas to drive to 1247 Maple Creek Road. I had no idea I was about to discover that James Sterling had spent 3 years planning the most beautiful revenge in history, and that the woman his family thought they had destroyed was about to become their worst nightmare. The GPS on my phone died 20 minutes before I reached Maple Creek Road, leaving me driving through countryside I'd never seen before with nothing but printed directions from MapQuest. The roads got narrower, the houses got sparser, and my anxiety got stronger with every mile. What was I doing? I was supposed to be in court right now, fighting for my children. Instead, I was chasing some desperate hope that a man who'd left me $12 might have somehow left me something valuable in the middle of nowhere. The address led me down a dirt road lined with overgrown trees, past a rusted mailbox that barely showed the numbers 1247. My heart sank as I pulled up to what could only be described as a shack. The cottage looked like it had been abandoned for decades, sagging roof, broken windows, porch steps that had rotted through. Paint peeled from every surface, and weeds grew so high they nearly covered the front door. This was my inheritance. This was what James thought I was worth. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, engine off, staring at the wreckage of what had once been someone's home. The irony was almost funny. The Sterling family had laughed at my $12 inheritance, but this cottage was probably worth even less. I'd driven 2 hours to look at a building that would cost more to demolish than it was worth. But I was here, and something deep in my chest, maybe desperation, maybe the last shred of faith in the man I'd loved, made me get out of the car. The front door was locked, but one of the broken windows was large enough to climb through. I was probably trespassing on my own property, which seemed fitting for how my life was going. The inside was just as depressing as the outside. Dust covered everything, sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, and the floorboards creaked ominously with every step. It was a single room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of furniture covered in sheets, and absolutely nothing that looked valuable. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd about the fireplace. There was a metal box sitting on the mantel, completely free of dust, unlike everything else in the room. Someone had been here recently. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside was a key, an envelope with my name written in James's handwriting, and a smartphone I'd never seen before. The letter was dated 3 weeks before James died. My dearest Amara, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my family has shown you exactly who they really are. I'm so sorry, my love. I'm sorry for the pain they've caused you. I'm sorry for the humiliation, and I'm sorry it took my death for you to see the truth I should have prepared you for. I know they've taken everything from you. The house, the money, probably even tried to take our boys. I know they've laughed at this cottage and your $12 inheritance. I know they think they've won. They have no idea what they've actually done. That phone contains recordings of every family meeting I attended for the past 2 years. Every racist comment about you, every plan to push you out, every scheme to take our children. Everything. But more importantly, this cottage isn't what it appears to be. Look for the loose stone in the fireplace, 3rd row from the bottom, 2nd stone from the left. What you find there will change everything. I spent 3 years watching my family treat you like you were worthless. 3 years listening to them plan for the day they could get rid of you. 3 years pretending to agree with them while I planned something they never saw coming. They think they're so smart, Amara. They think they understand money and power and manipulation. But they never understood the most important thing. I loved you more than I loved any of them. And I was willing to burn down everything they valued to protect you. The woman reading this letter owns everything they think belongs to them. Use it wisely. All my love forever.
James.
P.S. Check the phone. I left you some very interesting voicemails. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. I read it 3 times before the words started making sense. Then I knelt by the fireplace and found the stone he'd described. It was loose, just like he'd said. When I pulled it out, there was a hollow space behind it containing a thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope was a deed. Not to this cottage, to a property called Sterling Holdings, LLC. And according to the legal documents, Sterling Holdings, LLC owned everything. Sterling Industries, Sterling Real Estate, Sterling Investments, every company and property and asset the family thought belonged to them. And Sterling Holdings, LLC was wholly owned by Amara Sterling.
Me.
I owned everything. The next document was a bank statement showing an account with $53 million in it. In my name. Opened 3 years ago, the same week James and I got married. The third document was a life insurance policy worth $20 million. Also in my name. The fourth was a stock portfolio worth another $30 million. Also mine. Every document was signed, notarized, filed with the appropriate agencies. Every transfer was legal, documented, ironclad. James had spent 3 years quietly moving every piece of the Sterling fortune into my name, using shell companies and legal maneuvers his family knew nothing about. I sank onto the dusty floor, surrounded by papers that made me one of the wealthiest women in the state, while my phone buzzed with missed calls from family court asking where I was. The smartphone James had left me contained 47 voicemails. I pressed play on the first one. Amara, it's me. If you're listening to this, then they've already started their campaign to take our boys from you. I want you to know that I've been recording every family meeting for 2 years. You need to hear what they really think about you, about us, about our children. The next voicemail was a recording from a Sterling family meeting. I recognized all their voices: Victoria, Richard, Catherine, Michael, David Sr. The prenup is clear, Richard's voice said. When James dies, she gets nothing significant. She'll be desperate within weeks. And that's when we offer the custody arrangement, Victoria added. She'll have no choice but to accept. What if she fights us?
Catherine asked.
With what money? Richard laughed. She signed away any claim to James's assets. She'll be a single mother with no income and no legal representation. The courts will see that the children are better off with us. I still think we should be more generous, James's voice said. I gasped hearing him, even on a recording. She's the mother of my children. James, darling. Victoria's voice dripped with condescension. She was a phase.
A mistake.
The boys are Sterlings. They need to be raised by Sterlings. That girl is never going to fit into this family. That girl has a name, Mother. That girl, Richard interrupted, was a gold digger who got pregnant on purpose to trap you. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. I pressed skip, jumping to another recording. This one was more recent. I could tell because James sounded different.
Sadder.
The boys call her the maid when they think I can't hear them, James said quietly. They're teaching my children to look down on their own mother. They're teaching your children proper social hierarchy, Catherine replied. Amara is lovely, I'm sure, but she's not one of us. The boys need to understand that. She's my wife. She's your wife, Victoria agreed. But she'll never be family. And when you're gone, God forbid, she certainly won't be their mother in any meaningful way. What do you mean, when I'm gone? Oh, darling, we all die eventually. And when you do, that prenup ensures she goes back where she belongs. The boys will have proper guardians and proper influences. You mean you. We mean people who understand what it means to be a Sterling. I skipped to the final recording. The date stamp showed it was made just 5 days before James died. They bought her apartment building, James said, his voice tight with anger. They're planning to triple her rent the day after the will reading. They've already filed preliminary custody papers. They're going to destroy her systematically, and they think I don't know. James, you're being dramatic, Victoria's voice said. We're simply ensuring the children's welfare. You're ensuring she can't fight back. You've eliminated every option except surrender. Sometimes surrender is the wisest choice, Richard added. She'll thank us eventually. No, James said quietly. She won't. Because I'm not going to let this happen. What do you mean? I mean, I've been moving assets for 3 years. I mean, every company you think you own actually belongs to my wife. I mean, when I die, she's going to inherit everything you've spent your lives building. The silence on the recording was deafening. You can't be serious, Catherine whispered. Sterling Holdings LLC was incorporated 3 years ago. It owns everything, the companies, the real estate, the investment portfolios. Sterling Holdings LLC is owned entirely by Amara Sterling. When I die, she'll have the power to destroy every single one of you. That's impossible, Richard said, but his voice was shaking. The prenup dash. The prenup covers my personal assets. It doesn't cover Sterling Holdings LLC, which technically isn't mine. It's a separate corporate entity that happens to own everything you think belongs to this family. James, what have you done? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. I've ensured that the woman you've spent 3 years humiliating will have the power to humiliate you back. I've given the woman you call worthless the ability to take everything you value. And I've made sure that if anything happens to me, she'll have the resources to be the kind of mother our boys deserve. You're insane. I'm protecting my family.
My real family.
Amara and our children. She'll destroy us, Catherine said. That depends entirely on how you treat her after I'm gone. If you're kind, if you're respectful, if you treat her like the sterling matriarch she actually is, then maybe she'll be merciful. But if you try to take her children, if you humiliate her, if you treat her like she's worthless, she'll what? She'll own you. Completely. The recording ended there. I sat in that dusty cottage, surrounded by legal documents that made me richer than most small countries, listening to my dead husband deliver threats to his family from beyond the grave. The man who had seemed so passive, so unwilling to stand up to them, had been planning their destruction for years. But the most beautiful part? They had triggered their own downfall. Everything James had warned them not to do, they had done. They had taken my children, humiliated me, tried to destroy me systematically. They had laughed at my poverty while I secretly owned everything they thought was theirs. And now I had recordings of them planning it all.
The phone rang.
Victoria Sterling. Amara, dear, you missed the custody hearing. I'm afraid the judge had no choice but to award us temporary custody of the boys. But don't worry, you can visit them this weekend if you'd like. I stared at the bank statement showing $53 million in my account. Actually, Victoria, I have a better idea. Why don't you bring the boys to me? I have something I'd like to show all of you. I'm sorry, dear, but we've already moved the children to the estate. Their things are being packed as we speak. Perhaps it's better this way. They'll have time to adjust to their new environment. Their new environment. In the house I apparently owned. What time would be convenient for me to collect them? Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, Amara, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The custody arrangement is permanent. Well, unless you can prove you're financially stable enough to provide for them, which I think we both know isn't possible. I see. And what would constitute financially stable in your opinion? Oh, I don't know. Steady employment, adequate housing, some savings. The basics that any responsible parent should have. I looked around the cottage that had hidden the key to the sterling fortune. Would $50 million be adequate? Silence. I'm sorry, what did you say? I asked if $50 million would be considered adequate for raising 3 children. Amara, are you feeling all right? Did you hit your head? I'm feeling perfectly fine, Victoria. In fact, I'm feeling better than I have in months. I'll be by to collect my children this evening.
And Victoria?
Yes. We need to have a family meeting. All of you. There are some things about James's estate that weren't mentioned in the will reading. What things? Oh, just some minor corporate holdings that seem to have been overlooked. Sterling Industries, Sterling Real Estate, Sterling Investments. You know, the family businesses. Another long silence. I don't understand what you're implying. I'm not implying anything.
I am stating facts.
As of right now, I own everything your family thinks belongs to them. The houses you live in, the companies you work for, the bank accounts you draw from. All of it belongs to me. That's impossible. The paperwork suggests otherwise. James was very thorough in his planning. I could hear her breathing getting faster. Amara, I think we should meet and discuss this reasonably. There's clearly been some sort of mistake. The only mistake was underestimating the man you thought was weak, and underestimating the woman you thought was worthless. I hung up. For the first time in weeks, I was smiling. The Sterling family had just discovered that their victim owned everything they valued, and I had recorded evidence of every crime, every scheme, every racist comment they'd made about me and my children. James had been right about one thing. They really had triggered their own destruction. Now I just had to decide exactly how much mercy they deserved. Given how they'd treated me and my babies, I was thinking not very much at all. The phone call I'd just ended with Victoria Sterling was apparently the first domino in what would become the most spectacular family meltdown in recent memory. I didn't know this yet, sitting in that dusty cottage surrounded by documents that made me richer than some small nations, but I was about to find out. My phone started ringing again 30 seconds later. Richard Sterling this time. Amara, Victoria says you've made some rather extraordinary claims about family assets. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding.
No misunderstanding, Richard.
I own Sterling Holdings LLC, which owns everything your family has built for the past 40 years. I have the legal documents right here. That's simply not possible. I would know about any such transfers. Would you? Because according to these incorporation papers, James created Sterling Holdings 3 years ago using shell companies and legal structures your own attorneys recommended for tax purposes. Very clever, actually. You taught him how to hide assets from the government, and he used those same techniques to hide them from you. The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Where are you? He finally asked, his voice tight. I'm at 1247 Maple Creek Road. You know, the worthless cottage you all laughed about yesterday? Turns out it was never about the cottage. It was about what James hid inside it. We'll be right there. Actually, don't bother. I'm coming to you. I have some belongings to collect from my house. Your house? Sterling Estate. 445 Whitmore Drive. According to these documents, I've owned it for 3 years, along with the other 6 properties in the Sterling real estate portfolio. I hung up and started driving back toward the city, my hands still shaking but no longer from fear. For the first time since James died, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Power. The hour-long drive gave me time to think, to plan, to really absorb what James had done. He'd spent 3 years systematically transferring every major Sterling asset into my name while maintaining the illusion that his family still controlled everything. The monthly family meetings where they'd insulted me, plan my downfall, and discuss taking my children? James had been recording every single one while legally stealing their entire fortune. But the most beautiful part was the timing. The prenup they'd forced me to sign covered James's personal assets, his cars, his personal bank accounts, his individual stock holdings. It said nothing about Sterling Holdings LLC because that company hadn't existed when I signed the prenup. James had created it afterward, making sure every asset transfer was completely legal and ironclad. By the time I reached the Sterling estate, 6 cars were already in the circular driveway. The entire family had gathered for what I suspected was going to be a very different kind of family meeting than they were used to. I parked my beat-up car right in front of the main entrance, grabbed the manila envelope full of documents, and walked up to the front door of my own house. Victoria answered before I could knock, her face pale and her usual composure completely shattered. "Amara, thank God you're here. We need to sort this out immediately."
Hello, Victoria.
"I've come to collect my children." Of course, of course. But first, can we please discuss these ridiculous claims? Richard says you think you own Sterling Holdings. I don't think I own it. I do own it. 100%. I walked past her into the foyer where the entire Sterling family was assembled. Richard paced by the windows, his silver hair disheveled. Catherine sat rigidly on the white leather sofa, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. Michael and David Sr. flanked the fireplace, both looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Where are my boys?" "They're upstairs in the playroom," Victoria said quickly. "But Amara, we really must clear up this confusion before." "There's no confusion." I set the envelope on the coffee table and pulled out the Sterling Holdings Incorporation papers. James created this company 3 years ago. Every Sterling asset was transferred to Sterling Holdings. Sterling Holdings is owned entirely by me. Richard stopped pacing and grabbed the papers. His hands shook as he read them. "This can't be legal. We never approved these transfers." "You didn't need to approve them." James was a signatory on all Sterling accounts. He had power of attorney for Sterling Industries transactions. He used authority you gave him to protect the family wealth, and he used it to give that wealth to his wife. But the prenup covers James Michael Sterling's personal assets. It says nothing about Sterling Holdings LLC, because that company didn't exist when I signed it. Every transfer happened after our marriage, making it completely legal. Catherine stood up, her composure finally cracking. "You can't just steal our life's work." "I didn't steal anything. Your son gave it to me. Legally. Voluntarily. With full knowledge of what he was doing." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to one of James's recordings. "Would you like to hear him explain it in his own words?" I pressed play. James's voice filled the room, calm and determined. "Sterling Holdings LLC owns everything, the companies, the real estate, the investment portfolios. Sterling Holdings LLC is owned entirely by Amara Sterling. When I die, she'll have the power to destroy every single one of you." The color drained from every face in the room. "When did he record this?"
Victoria whispered.
2 weeks before he died. "But there are dozens of recordings, Victoria, including some very interesting conversations about your plans for me and my children." I played another clip. Victoria's voice sang, "That girl was a gold digger who got pregnant on purpose to trap you." Then Richard. "She'll be desperate within weeks." Then Catherine. "The boys need to understand proper social hierarchy. Amara is lovely, I'm sure, but she's not one of us." With each recording, they sank deeper into their chairs. Their own voices, their own words, their own schemes played back to them in digital perfection. James recorded everything. I continued. Every racist comment, every plan to take my children, every scheme to humiliate me. 3 years of evidence that you conspired to destroy a grieving widow. "Now see here," Richard started, his voice shaking with rage. "You may have some legal technicality, but this family has connections, influence. This family has nothing. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than Richard Sterling. Your connections work for companies I now own. Your influence comes from wealth that's now mine. Your social standing depends on assets that belong to me. Michael finally found his voice. What do you want? I want my children.
Now.
And then what? David Sr. asked. You destroy us all out of spite. I haven't decided yet. That depends entirely on how you handle the next few hours. Victoria was crying now, actual tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. Amara, please. We can work something out. We made mistakes, but we're family. Family? I laughed, and the sound was bitter. You spent 3 years telling me I wasn't family. You laughed when I inherited $12. You filed for custody of my children while I was burying my husband. You called me a gold digger and a mistake. We were grieving too, Catherine said desperately. We said things we didn't mean. You meant every word. James recorded you planning my destruction while his body was still in the morgue. That statement hit like a physical blow. Victoria gasped, Richard stumbled backward, and Catherine's face went white as paper. That's not. We never. You bought my apartment building to force me into homelessness. You increased my rent to force me to surrender my children. You hired private investigators to document my poverty. All of this was planned, coordinated, systematic. I pulled out another recording and let their own voices convict them. The custody papers are filed. She'll have no choice but to accept our terms. Stop, Victoria begged. Please stop. I'm going to get my children now. We're going home. To where? Richard asked desperately. That apartment is owned by Sterling Real Estate, which is owned by Sterling Holdings, which is owned by me. I'll be adjusting the rent back to reasonable levels immediately. For all tenants, not just myself. I walked toward the stairs, but Victoria grabbed my arm. Amara, wait. Let's discuss this rationally. You can't just take everything. We have employees, responsibilities, people depending on us. People you'll have to fire because you no longer own the companies that employ them. This will destroy hundreds of jobs. Then you should have thought of that before you tried to destroy me. I climbed the stairs to find my 3 little boys in a playroom that was bigger than our entire apartment. They were sitting quietly, not playing, just waiting. When they saw me, they ran over like they hadn't seen me in weeks instead of hours.
Nana.
Marcus wrapped his arms around my legs. Are we going home? Yes, baby. We're going home. To our real home? To our real home. As I carried Jonathan and held David's and Marcus's hands walking down that grand staircase, the Sterling family looked like they were attending their own funeral. This isn't over, Richard said quietly. You're right. It's just beginning. Tomorrow morning, I'll be meeting with Sterling Industries' board of directors to discuss some management changes. I suspect there will be several immediate resignations. You can't run these companies, Catherine said desperately. You don't know anything about business. I don't need to run them. I just need to own them. I'm sure I can find qualified people to manage day-to-day operations while the Sterling family finds new employment opportunities. Victoria was sobbing openly now. Please, Amara. We'll apologize. We'll make amends. Just don't destroy everything James's grandfather built. James's grandfather built an empire. You built a legacy of cruelty and racism. James chose which one deserved to survive. I loaded my boys into my car while the Sterling family stood in their doorway, watching their world collapse. Mama, David asked as we drove away, why was Grandma Victoria crying? Sometimes grown-ups cry when they realize they've made very bad choices, sweetheart. Are we going to see them again? I looked in the rearview mirror at the mansion I now owned, where 6 people stood watching their victim drive away with everything they'd ever valued. I'm sure we will, baby. I'm sure we will. That evening, I called Rebecca Morrison from my apartment. Rebecca, this is Amara Sterling. I need to schedule a meeting with Sterling Holdings' legal team tomorrow morning. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling, but I don't understand. Sterling Holdings isn't a Sterling family entity. Actually, it is. And I'm the Sterling family member who owns it. Check your incorporation records. Silence. Then frantic typing.
I see.
Yes, it appears. Mrs. Sterling, I think there's been some sort of error in our files. There's been no error. James Sterling legally transferred all family assets to Sterling Holdings LLC 3 years ago. Sterling Holdings is owned entirely by me. I'll need a complete audit of all Sterling family members' current compensation, benefits, and company access. Mrs. Sterling, I have to advise you that making precipitous changes to established business structures could have serious legal implications. Rebecca, let me be very clear. As of right now, you work for me. The Sterling family members who were laughing at my poverty yesterday no longer own anything you're managing. If you have a problem with that, I can find new legal representation. More typing. I see that the documentation appears to be in order. What specific actions are you requesting? I want all Sterling family members removed from company accounts, company credit cards, and company access. Immediately. I want their salaries suspended pending a review of their actual contributions to company operations. And I want a meeting with all department heads tomorrow to discuss the transition. Mrs. Sterling, this will cause significant disruption. Good. They disrupted my life. Now it's their turn. What about their housing? Several family members live in company-owned properties. They can submit rental applications like anyone else, at market rates. I hung up and looked around my tiny apartment. My boys were playing with their few remaining toys, happy to be home, unaware that their mother had just become one of the most powerful women in the state. Tomorrow, the Sterling family would wake up to discover they had no income, no company access, no company housing, and no control over the empire they'd spent their lives building. Tomorrow, they'd wake up exactly where I had woken up 2 weeks ago, with nothing. But unlike me, they deserved everything that was coming to them. My phone rang. Victoria, again. Amara, please. We need to talk. As a family. We're not family, Victoria. You made that very clear. We made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But this scorched earth approach won't bring James back. No, but it will ensure that my children grow up knowing their mother isn't someone to be trifled with. Your children need stability, not revenge. My children need to see that bad actions have consequences. They need to understand that you can't build a life on cruelty and expect that life to last forever. We'll fight this. We have lawyers. You had lawyers. As of tonight, you can't afford lawyers. As of tonight, you can't afford anything. Amara, please. Please what? Please have mercy? Please forgive and forget? Where was that mercy when you were laughing at my $12? Where was that forgiveness when you were filing custody papers? I could hear her crying through the phone. James wouldn't want this, she whispered. James planned this. Every detail. He spent 3 years setting up your destruction because he knew exactly who you really were. He was our son. He was my husband. And he protected his family. His real family. I hung up. That night, as I tucked my boys into their own beds in their own room, Marcus asked me a question that stopped my heart. Mama, are we rich now? Why do you ask that, sweetheart? Because you're not scared anymore. You were scared before, but now you're not. Out of the mouths of babes. We're going to be okay, baby. We're going to be more than okay. Are Grandma Victoria and Grandpa Richard going to be okay? I thought about 6 people who had systematically tried to destroy a grieving widow and steal her children, who were now facing the complete collapse of everything they'd valued in life. That depends on them, sweetheart. That depends entirely on them. The next morning would bring the Sterling family's first real taste of powerlessness. But tonight, I fell asleep in my own bed, with my own children safe in the next room, knowing that James Sterling had given me the greatest gift imaginable, the ability to ensure that cruelty would always, eventually, meet justice. And the Sterling family was about to learn exactly what justice looked like when delivered by the woman they'd thought was worthless. The morning after I'd taken back my children and my power, I woke up to 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and a dozen people standing outside my apartment building at 6 in the morning. The Sterling family had apparently called an emergency meeting of every lawyer, accountant, and business associate they could reach, and now my building looked like a convention for expensive suits. I made coffee and watched from my window as Victoria Sterling paced in front of my building, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her perfect hair disheveled for the first time since I'd known her. Richard stood by a black Mercedes, talking rapidly into his phone while gesturing wildly with his free hand. Catherine sat on the steps looking like she'd been crying all night. They looked desperate. Broken. Exactly how they'd made me feel 2 weeks ago.
My phone rang.
A number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Sterling? This is Margaret Chen from Sterling Industries Human Resources. I apologize for calling so early, but we have a situation. Several department heads are requesting clarification about yesterday's ownership transfer, and there's some confusion about payroll authorization. What kind of confusion? Well, Mr. Richard Sterling attempted to authorize payroll for this week, but his access has been revoked. The system shows you as the sole signatory for all company accounts. Without your authorization, we can't process anyone's salary, including our 2,000 employees. 2,000 employees who would go without paychecks because I'd locked the Sterling family out of their own companies. 2,000 families who depended on Sterling Industries for their livelihood, now caught in the middle of my war with the people who'd tried to destroy me. I'll be in this morning to sort out payroll, I said. Make sure everyone gets paid on schedule. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. Also, there are several reporters in the lobby asking about the ownership change. Word seems to be spreading quickly. Reporters. Of course. The transfer of a $50 million empire doesn't happen quietly, especially when it involves one of the state's most prominent families. I hung up and immediately called Rebecca Morrison. Rebecca, I need you to handle media inquiries about Sterling Holdings. No statements until I've had time to review everything. Mrs. Sterling, I have to tell you, this situation is unprecedented. The Sterling family's lawyers are claiming fraud, undue influence, mental incompetence on James's part. They're threatening to challenge every transaction. Let them try. James was mentally competent when he set this up, and I have recordings proving the family knew exactly what he was doing. About those recordings, Mrs. Sterling, I need to advise you that recording people without their consent may violate wiretapping laws in this state. James made those recordings in his own home during family meetings he was invited to attend. I've researched the legality thoroughly. Even so, using them publicly could create complications. Then we won't use them publicly unless we have to. But Rebecca? Make sure the Sterling family knows they exist. Sometimes the threat of exposure is more powerful than exposure itself. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple but professional outfit that said competent businesswoman rather than grieving widow. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was putting on armor instead of funeral clothes. When I stepped outside my building, the crowd of suits turned toward me like flowers following the sun. Victoria Sterling broke away from the group and rushed over, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. Amara, thank God.
We need to talk.
Privately. We can talk right here.
Please.
As one mother to another. 5 minutes. Something in her voice made me pause. This wasn't the imperious Victoria Sterling who'd counted out $12 into my palm 3 days ago. This was a woman on the edge of complete breakdown. 5 minutes. We walked to a coffee shop around the corner, leaving the crowd of lawyers and reporters behind. Victoria ordered nothing, just sat across from me with her hands shaking as I sipped my coffee. I didn't sleep at all last night, she began. I kept thinking about what you said. About James planning this for 3 years. About him recording everything. And he was protecting you. From us. Her voice cracked. My own son spent 3 years planning to destroy his family because he knew we'd destroy his wife. That's right. What kind of people does that make us? It was the first moment of genuine self-reflection I'd ever seen from Victoria Sterling. For 3 years, she'd been a pillar of cold certainty, absolutely convinced of her own superiority. Now she looked like a woman staring into a mirror and hating what she saw. That's not for me to answer, I said. You have every right to destroy us. I understand that now. But, Amara, there are 2,000 people who work for Sterling Industries. There are dozens of smaller companies that depend on Sterling contracts. There are charities we fund, scholarships we provide, all of which will continue operating under new management. But the disruption alone will cause massive damage. People will lose their jobs while new management gets established. Projects will be canceled. Contracts will be voided. She was right, and we both knew it. My revenge against 6 people would inevitably hurt hundreds of others. What are you asking me to do, Victoria? I'm asking you to let us fix this. Give us a chance to make amends before you tear down everything James's grandfather built. What kind of amends? Victoria pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed her carrying. Inside were documents that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Full public apology to you and the boys. Published in the Times. Acknowledgement that we treated you abominably and that our actions were motivated by racism and classism. The first document was a draft letter to the editor, signed by all 6 Sterling family members, accepting full responsibility for their treatment of me and publicly apologizing for their attempt to take my children. Complete resignation from all management positions in Sterling companies. We'll step away from day-to-day operations entirely, allowing you to bring in new leadership without the disruption of forcing us out. The second document was a set of resignation letters, effective immediately. Establishment of a scholarship fund in James's name, focused on supporting single mothers pursuing education. Initial funding of $5 million. The third document outlined a comprehensive scholarship program that would help women like me build better lives for their children. And personal accountability, Victoria finished quietly. Community service. Donations to anti-racism organizations. Public support for policies that help single mothers. It was more than I'd expected. More than I dared to hope for when I was sitting in that cottage yesterday, holding James's letter. Why now? I asked. Why not 3 days ago, when you were laughing at my inheritance? Victoria's mask finally fell completely. Because 3 days ago I thought we were better than you. I thought we deserved everything we had because we were born to it. I thought you were trying to take something that didn't belong to you. And now I realize that everything we had was built on the assumption that people like you would never have the power to fight back. That we could treat you however we wanted because you'd never be able to make us face consequences. She looked out the coffee shop window at the reporters still gathered around my building. James gave you that power. And in doing so, he forced us to confront who we really are. We're people who would steal children from their mother. We're people who would laugh at a widow's poverty. We're people who would conspire to destroy someone for the crime of loving our son. Tears started flowing down her cheeks again. I have to live with that now. We all do. But, Amara, you have a choice to make too. What choice? You can be better than us. You can choose mercy when we chose cruelty. You can choose justice when we chose revenge. It was a powerful appeal, and Victoria Sterling knew exactly what she was doing. She was gambling that the woman they'd try to break was too good to break them in return. The terrible thing was she might be right. That afternoon, I drove to Sterling Industries headquarters for the first time in my life. The building was a gleaming monument to corporate success, 30 floors of glass and steel that declared the Sterling family's importance to anyone who looked at it. The lobby was chaos. Reporters, employees, lawyers, and business associates all crowded together, everyone trying to understand what was happening to one of the state's most stable companies. Security guards looked overwhelmed, and the receptionist kept repeating that she had no information about recent changes in ownership. When I walked in, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Someone whispered, "That's her. That's the widow." I rode the elevator to the 30th floor, where the executive offices occupied a space larger than most people's homes. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the entire city, and everything from the marble floors to the crystal light fixtures screamed expensive taste. Margaret Chin from Human Resources met me at the elevator. She was a small, efficient woman in her 50s who looked like she'd been awake all night solving problems. "Mrs. Sterling, thank you for coming. We've managed to delay payroll processing until this afternoon, but we really need authorization to proceed." "Of course. What else needs immediate attention?" "Well, we have board meetings scheduled for next week that will need to be rescheduled. Several major contracts are pending approval signatures. And frankly, the entire executive team is in crisis mode trying to understand what's happening." She led me to what had apparently been Richard Sterling's office, a space so large it could have housed my entire apartment twice over. His personal effects were still there, family photos, awards, expensive art, but security had already changed the locks on his filing cabinets. "Mrs. Sterling, if I may ask, what are your plans for company operations? The uncertainty is creating significant anxiety among department heads." It was a fair question. I'd spent so much energy planning my revenge against the Sterling family that I hadn't really considered what came next. "I want to meet with all department heads this afternoon. I need to understand how the company actually operates before I make any major decisions." "Of course. Also, there's been significant media interest. The business reporters are calling this the largest family wealth transfer in the state's history." That afternoon's meetings were a crash course in corporate management I'd never expected to need. Sterling Industries was far more complex than I'd realized: manufacturing, real estate development, construction, technology investments, and a dozen smaller subsidiaries. The company employed people across 4 states and had contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every department had asked the same questions. What were my plans? Would there be layoffs? Would contracts be honored? Would the company culture change? I found myself giving the same answer over and over. I'm here to learn. No immediate changes except ensuring everyone gets paid and all commitments are honored. But the real test came when I met with the Sterling Industries Charitable Foundation. The foundation director, a passionate woman named Sarah Martinez, walked me through programs the company funded. Scholarships for underprivileged students, housing initiatives for low-income families, small business loans for minority entrepreneurs, job training programs for single mothers. "Mrs. Sterling," Sarah said, "I have to ask, will the foundation continue operating? We have commitments to over 300 families currently receiving assistance. 300 families who depended on Sterling money to survive. Single mothers like I'd been, getting help to build better lives for their children. The foundation will not only continue," I heard myself saying, "we're going to expand it. Expand it. Double the scholarship budget. Triple the single mother assistance program. And add a new initiative for families dealing with custody battles." Sarah's face lit up. "Mrs. Sterling, that would be incredible." By the end of the day, I was exhausted but enlightened. The Sterling family hadn't just built a business empire, they'd created something that genuinely helped people. Destroying it out of spite would hurt far more innocent families than guilty ones. That evening, as I tucked my boys into bed, Marcus asked me a question that cut straight to the heart of my dilemma. "Mama, what's going to happen to Grandma Victoria and Grandpa Richard?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "At school, when kids are mean to other kids, the teacher makes them apologize and then they get to be friends again. Are you and Grandma Victoria going to be friends again?" From a 3-year-old's perspective, it really was that simple. Someone did something mean, they apologized, everyone moved on. "I don't know yet, baby. What do you think should happen?" "I think Grandma Victoria should say she's sorry for making you cry." And then maybe we could all have dinner together again. Out of the mouths of babes. That night, I called Victoria Sterling. Amara? Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you would. I've been thinking about your proposal, I interrupted. I have some conditions. Anything. Name them. The public apology needs to be specific. Not just general remorse, but detailed acknowledgement of what you did and why it was wrong. Of course. The scholarship fund needs to be 10 million, not 5. And it needs to be administered by people you don't control. Agreed. Each family member commits to 1,000 hours of community service over the next 2 years. Real service, not just writing checks. We'll do it. And you stay away from my children until they're old enough to choose for themselves whether they want a relationship with you. Silence. This was the condition that would hurt the most. How long? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Until they're 18. Amara, please. They're our grandchildren. They're my children. And I won't have them confused by people who called their mother worthless. But 15 years is less time than you planned to give me with them when you filed for custody. Another long silence. All right, she finally said. We accept your terms. There's one more thing.
What?
I want to meet with all of you tomorrow. Together. Because while I'm willing to show mercy, I'm not willing to forget. And there are some things that need to be said. The next morning, the Sterling family gathered in the conference room where they'd laughed at my $12 inheritance just 4 days earlier. But this time, I sat at the head of the table while they arranged themselves along the sides like defendants waiting for sentencing. Victoria had dark circles under her eyes. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Catherine kept fidgeting with her jewelry, and the two brothers stared at the table like condemned men. Before we discuss moving forward, I began. I want to make sure everyone understands exactly where we stand. I placed a recording device on the table. James left me 47 recordings of family meetings. Every racist comment, every plan to destroy me, every scheme to take my children, every single conversation where you plotted against the woman your son loved. I pressed play on one of the recordings, Catherine's voice saying, "That girl was never going to fit into this family." Then Richard. She was a gold digger who got pregnant on purpose. Then Victoria. The boys need to understand proper social hierarchy. With each quote, they sank deeper into their chairs. Their own words, spoken in their own voices, filled the room with the poison they'd been spreading for 3 years. James heard all of this. I continued. He knew exactly who you were, what you thought of me, and what you planned to do when he was gone. So, he spent 3 years giving me the power to destroy you. Amara, Richard began, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You need to understand something. I'm not showing you mercy because you deserve it. I'm showing you mercy because my children deserve to see their mother choose justice over revenge. Because the 2,000 people who work for Sterling Industries deserve stability. Because the 300 families helped by your foundation deserve continued support. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the most powerful person in the room. But make no mistake. This mercy comes with conditions. You will fulfill every promise you made yesterday. You will stay away from my children. You will accept whatever role I choose to give you in the companies you used to own. And if any of you ever tries to undermine me or my family again, I will release every recording James made and destroy you so completely that you'll wish I'd just taken your money. Victoria was crying again, but these weren't tears of manipulation. These were tears of genuine remorse. We understand, she whispered.
Do you?
Because 3 days ago, you were laughing at the idea that I could survive on $12. Now I'm the person who decides whether you survive at all. The meeting ended with signed agreements, resigned positions, and 6 people who finally understood that actions have consequences. As they filed out of the conference room, Victoria stopped at the door. Amara? For what it's worth, James was right about you. You are worth 10 of us. It was the first genuine compliment she'd ever given me. That afternoon, I sat in what had been Richard Sterling's office, looking out at a city where I now owned more property than most corporations. My boys were in a playroom down the hall, watched by a nanny I could finally afford. For the first time in weeks, they were laughing. Margaret Chin knocked and entered with a stack of papers. "Mrs. Sterling? I have the revised organizational charts you requested. Also, the board meeting is scheduled for Friday to officially transition leadership." "Thank you, Margaret. Any word from the Sterling family?" "They've all cleared out their offices. Very quietly, very cooperatively. Mr. Richard left a note saying he hopes you'll consider keeping the current management structure in place." I smiled. Of course he did. Even in defeat, Richard Sterling was trying to maintain some influence. "What do you think, Margaret? Should we keep the current management structure?" Honestly, most of the department heads are excellent at their jobs. The company runs well because of good middle management, not because of the Sterling family's oversight. Then we'll keep the good people and improve on what needs improving. Mrs. Sterling? If I may say so, this transition has been handled with remarkable grace, considering the circumstances.
Grace.
I thought about James, who'd planned this entire scenario because he knew his family would show me no grace at all. "My husband taught me that the best revenge is living well," I said. "I'm just trying to live very, very well." That evening, as I sat in my small apartment with my boys, I realized I'd passed the first real test of my new power. I'd had the ability to destroy 6 people completely, and I'd chosen to destroy only their ability to hurt others. James would have been proud. But more importantly, my boys would grow up knowing their mother was the kind of woman who chose justice over vengeance, strength over cruelty, mercy over revenge. The Sterling family would spend the rest of their lives remembering the woman they'd called worthless, the woman who'd ended up owning everything they'd ever valued, and who'd been generous enough to let them keep their dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that power doesn't have to corrupt. But tonight, I was just a mother who'd protected her children and built them a future where no one would ever be able to call them worthless again. The impossible choice between mercy and revenge hadn't been impossible after all. I'd found a third option, justice. And justice, it turned out, was far more satisfying than revenge could ever be. 6 months after I'd taken control of the Sterling Empire, the annual Sterling Industries Charity Gala was scheduled to take place. It had been a tradition for 25 years, the social event of the season where the city's elite gathered to celebrate philanthropy while the Sterling family basked in public adoration for their generosity. This year would be different. I'd spent those 6 months quietly rebuilding not just the company's, but my own life. The boys were thriving in a new private school where they were loved for who they were, not what their last name represented. I'd hired the best management team money could buy, and Sterling Industries was more profitable than ever. The charitable foundation had tripled its impact, helping over 1,000 families escape poverty. But the Sterling family had been quietly working against me the entire time. It started small. Whispered conversations at country club events about my questionable background. Anonymous tips to business reporters suggesting the ownership transfer had been fraudulent. Subtle pressure on Sterling Industries clients to consider taking their business elsewhere. Victoria, Richard, Catherine, and the others had been fulfilling their public commitments. The community service, the scholarship fund, the published apology. But privately, they'd been conducting a careful campaign to undermine my reputation and credibility. They thought they were being subtle. They thought I wouldn't notice. They forgot that James had taught me to document everything. Margaret Chin brought me the evidence on a Tuesday morning, looking grim as she set a thick folder on my desk. "Mrs. Sterling, you need to see this. Our security team has been monitoring communications as you requested." Inside the folder were phone records, email transcripts, and recorded conversations that painted a clear picture of the Sterling family's real feelings about our agreement. Richard's voice on a call to the governor. The ownership transfer was clearly the result of undue influence. A grieving man manipulated by a gold digger. Catherine's email to major Sterling Industries clients. We want to assure you that the recent changes are temporary. The family is exploring all legal options to restore proper leadership. Victoria's conversation with a private investigator. Keep digging into her background. There has to be something we can use to prove she's unfit to control family assets. Most damning of all was a recording from just 3 days earlier, a family meeting where they discussed their real strategy. The charity gala is perfect, Michael's voice said. Half the city's power brokers will be there. If we can create enough doubt about her legitimacy, we can force a shareholder revolt. What about the recordings she has of us? David Sr. asked. She won't use them, Victoria replied confidently. She's too concerned about her precious reputation. She wants to be seen as the gracious widow who showed mercy, not the vindictive woman who destroyed a family. And if she does use them, then we claim they were taken illegally. That James was mentally unstable when he recorded them. That she's manipulating a dead man's voice to justify theft. Richard's voice was coldly calculating. Either way, by the end of the gala, the business community will understand that Sterling Industries belongs in sterling hands. Real sterling hands. I listened to that recording 3 times, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. They'd mistaken my mercy for weakness. They'd interpreted my choice of justice over revenge as evidence that I could be manipulated. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The charity gala was held at the Grandview Hotel's ballroom, a space that could accommodate 800 guests in the kind of luxury that made even rich people feel rich. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Every year, it was the Sterling family's moment to shine. This year, it would be their moment to fall. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a dress that had cost more than the Sterling family's monthly allowance and jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight. But the real statement was my confidence. 6 months ago, I'd been a broken widow clutching $12. Tonight, I walked into that ballroom like I owned it, which technically I did. The guest list read like a who's who of the state's power structure. Governors and senators, CEOs and judges, society matrons and business titans. Everyone who mattered in our corner of the world was there, dressed in their finest and ready to celebrate another year of Sterling generosity. The Sterling family had positioned themselves strategically throughout the room. Victoria held court near the auction display, describing the family's charitable legacy to anyone who would listen. Richard stood by the bar, regaling business associates with stories about temporary disruptions in company leadership. Catherine worked the room like a political candidate, subtly planting seeds of doubt about my fitness to control family assets. They were executing their plan perfectly. By the time I took the stage for the traditional Sterling family address, half the room would be questioning whether I deserved to be there. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the past week preparing a very different kind of address than they expected. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator announced as dessert was being served, please welcome the current head of Sterling Industries and the Sterling Foundation, Mrs. Amara Sterling. The applause was polite but noticeably lukewarm. The Sterling family had done their work well. I could see the uncertainty in people's faces, the whispered conversations behind programs, the way some guests avoided eye contact. I took the podium with a smile that probably looked serene to the audience, but felt predatory to me. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began. For 25 years, this gala has celebrated the Sterling family's commitment to philanthropy and community service. Tonight, I want to tell you the real story of that commitment. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the usual script. 6 months ago, I inherited control of Sterling Industries under circumstances that some of you may have questions about. I'd like to address those questions directly. I could see Victoria stiffen near the auction table. Richard's conversation with the governor stopped mid-sentence. Catherine looked like she was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. My late husband, James Sterling, spent the final 3 years of his life systematically transferring every major sterling asset to a company he created in my name. Some of you may wonder why he would do such a thing. I gestured to the audiovisual team, and the first recording began playing through the ballroom's sound system. James's voice, clear and strong. I've been moving assets for 3 years. Every company you think you own actually belongs to my wife. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. James made this decision, I continued, because he knew exactly what his family planned to do to me after his death. He recorded their plans in detail. The next recording was Victoria's voice. When James dies, she gets nothing significant. She'll be desperate within weeks. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria had gone pale as marble. Let me be clear about what the Sterling family planned, I said, my voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent ballroom. They intended to strip a grieving widow of her home, her security, and her children. They succeeded in the first 2. They almost succeeded in the third. Richard's recorded voice filled the room. She'll be a single mother with no income and no legal representation. The courts will see that the children are better off with us. I could see people throughout the ballroom turning to stare at the Sterling family members, who looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. But their plan went deeper than simple cruelty, I continued. They bought my apartment building to force me into homelessness. They hired private investigators to document my poverty. They coordinated their efforts to systematically destroy any possibility of my independent survival. Catherine's voice came through the speakers. The custody papers are filed. She'll have no choice but to accept our terms. The gasps were louder now, mixed with angry murmurs. Some of the city's most prominent citizens were learning that people they'd respected for decades had conspired to destroy a widow and steal her children. Now, some of you might think this is just a family dispute, I said. But I want you to understand exactly why they targeted me so viciously. The next recording was the one that cut deepest. Richard's voice, dripping with contempt. That girl was a gold digger who got pregnant on purpose to trap you. Victoria's voice followed. She's lovely, I'm sure, but she's not one of us. The boys need to understand proper social hierarchy. Then Catherine. That girl was never going to fit into this family. The anger in the room was palpable now. These weren't just recordings of family disputes. They were recordings of systematic racism and classism being planned and executed by people who held themselves up as pillars of the community. For 3 years, I continued, I tried to become the daughter-in-law they wanted. I changed my major, my appearance, my personality. I signed a prenup without reading it because I trusted that the man I loved would protect me. I believed that if I just tried hard enough, they would eventually accept me. My voice strengthened as I reached the heart of my message. But James knew better. He knew that no amount of trying would ever make me acceptable to people who had already decided I was worthless because of where I came from and what I looked like. So he spent 3 years ensuring that when they showed their true nature, I would have the power to respond. I gestured to the screen behind me, which began displaying financial documents. The Sterling family has claimed that the asset transfer was fraudulent, that James was mentally incompetent, that I manipulated a grieving man. Let me show you exactly how incompetent my husband was. The screen showed incorporation documents for Sterling Holdings LLC, dated 3 years before James's death. Every signature was notarized, every transfer was documented, every legal requirement was meticulously fulfilled. James created a complex corporate structure using the same legal strategies the Sterling family had used for decades to avoid taxes and protect assets. He used their own attorneys, their own accountants, their own legal precedents. Every transfer was reviewed and approved by the same law firm that had served the Sterling family for 40 years. More documents appeared on screen: board meeting minutes, shareholder agreements, audit reports. Every piece of paper that proved James had been methodical, deliberate, and completely competent in his planning. But perhaps most importantly, I said, James left detailed written explanations for every decision. The final recording began playing. James's voice, recorded just days before his death. If anyone claims I was manipulated or incompetent, they're lying. I'm making these transfers because I love my wife and children more than I love family approval. I'm ensuring that the woman my family calls worthless will have the power to prove her worth to everyone. The silence in the ballroom was complete now. 800 of the city's most influential people sat frozen as they absorbed the reality of what they'd just heard. Now, I continued, I want to tell you what I've done with the power James gave me. The screen behind me changed to show charts and graphs displaying Sterling Industries' performance over the past 6 months. Company profits are up 37%. Employee satisfaction has increased dramatically. Our charitable foundation has tripled its impact, helping over 1,000 families escape poverty. We've created 200 new jobs and expanded into 3 new markets. I could see the amazement in people's faces as they processed the numbers. But more importantly, we've fundamentally changed how Sterling Industries operates. Every employee now earns a living wage. Every family has comprehensive health care. Every child of every employee has access to educational support. We've proven that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right, it's profitable. The murmurs in the crowd were turning positive now. Business leaders were always impressed by improved numbers, but they were even more impressed by sustainable growth that lifted everyone up. The Sterling family has spent the past 6 months quietly trying to undermine my leadership, I continued. They've whispered about my qualifications, my background, my fitness to control family assets. They've suggested to clients that these changes are temporary, that they're working to restore proper leadership. Victoria looked like she might faint. Richard was staring at his shoes. Catherine had her hand over her mouth like she was trying to keep words from escaping. So let me be absolutely clear, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned exactly how powerful she really was. I am not a temporary custodian of Sterling assets. I am not a grieving widow in over her head. I am not the gold digger or the mistake or the phase that the Sterling family convinced themselves I was. I stepped closer to the microphone, and every person in that ballroom leaned forward to hear what came next. I am Amara Sterling. I am the woman James Sterling loved enough to give everything to. I am the mother he trusted to raise his children. I am the leader he chose to carry on his legacy. And I am the person who will ensure that Sterling Industries continues to grow, prosper, and make a positive impact on this community for decades to come. The applause started slowly, from a table near the back. Then it spread, row by row, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, giving me a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But I wasn't finished. However, I said as the applause died down, there is one more thing you all need to know. The room fell silent again, sensing that the evening's revelations weren't over. The Sterling family signed agreements 6 months ago acknowledging their wrongdoing and committing to make amends. They've fulfilled some of those commitments publicly while working against me privately. They've apologized in newspapers while undermining me in boardrooms. They've funded scholarships while spreading lies about my competence. I gestured to the audiovisual team one final time. 3 days ago, they held a family meeting to plan my public humiliation at this very event. I think you should hear what they really think about the agreements they signed. The final recording began playing. The Sterling family's own voices, caught in their conspiracy to destroy my reputation and retake control of the empire that no longer belonged to them. Victoria's voice. She won't use the recordings. She's too concerned about her precious reputation. Richard's voice. By the end of the gala, the business community will understand that Sterling Industries belongs in Sterling hands. Real Sterling hands. Michael's voice. If we can create enough doubt about her legitimacy, we can force a shareholder revolt. The anger in the room was immediate and intense. These weren't just business leaders anymore. They were community members who had been lied to and manipulated by people they trusted for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, this is who the Sterling family really is. These are the people who claim to represent family values while planning to steal children from their mother. These are the people who built their reputation on charity while practicing cruelty. These are the people who demand respect while showing none to others. I looked directly at Victoria, Richard, Catherine, and the others, who were now surrounded by 800 people staring at them with disgust and betrayal. The Sterling family chose to make this a public battle. They chose to bring their lies and schemes into this community. So, I'm giving you all the truth you deserve to have. The ballroom erupted. Not in applause this time, but in angry conversation as people turned to confront the Sterling family members scattered throughout the room. I watched as Victoria was surrounded by former friends demanding explanations. Richard tried to leave, but found his path blocked by business associates who had heard enough. Catherine stood alone by the auction table, abandoned by everyone who had been listening to her poisonous whispers just minutes earlier. Governor Matthews approached the podium as I stepped down, his face grim but determined. "Mrs. Sterling," he said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "I owe you an apology. Richard Sterling approached me last month suggesting that the state should investigate the ownership transfer for potential fraud. I'm embarrassed to say I was considering it. Thank you, Governor. But no apology is necessary. You were being given false information by people you had reason to trust. Nevertheless, I want to be clear, Sterling Industries has the state's full support under your leadership. Anyone suggesting otherwise will not be speaking for my administration." One by one, other influential figures approached to offer similar statements. CEOs who had been wavering on contracts reaffirmed their commitments. Society matrons who had been listening to Victoria's whispers publicly distanced themselves from her influence. Judges and politicians who had been considering the Sterling family's subtle pressures made clear that justice would not be influenced by wealth or connections. The Sterling family's reputation didn't just collapse that night. It was systematically destroyed by their own words, their own schemes, their own choices coming back to haunt them in the most public way possible. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone at the head table, looking out at a ballroom that had been transformed from a celebration of Sterling family power into a judgment of Sterling family character. Victoria approached me one final time, her face streaked with tears and her voice barely a whisper. "Amara, please. We made mistakes, but destroying us publicly won't bring James back." "You're right," I said calmly. "It won't bring James back. But it will ensure that my children grow up in a world where everyone knows exactly what their father thought of their mother. Where everyone understands that the woman you called worthless was actually worth everything." What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of your choices, just like you expected me to do. And us? The family? I looked at this woman who had spent 3 years trying to destroy me, who had laughed at my poverty, who had tried to steal my children, who had spent 6 months undermining every mercy I'd shown her. "You'll survive," I said finally. "You'll have to find new ways to matter, new ways to contribute, new ways to earn the respect you thought you deserved simply by being born. But you'll survive. Amara. The difference is that when I had to survive your cruelty, I did it alone. When you have to survive the consequences of that cruelty, you'll have each other. That's more mercy than you showed me." I walked away from Victoria Sterling for the last time, leaving her standing in a ballroom where everyone now knew exactly who she really was. The next morning, every major newspaper in the state carried the story. "Sterling family empire built on deception and racism," read the headline in the Times. "Widow exposes years of family conspiracy," declared the Herald. "Sterling Industries thrives under new leadership while former owners face public disgrace," announced the Business Journal. But the story that mattered most to me was smaller, buried on page 6 of the local paper. Sterling Foundation Scholarship Program expands to help 500 single mothers. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't destroying the people who had tried to destroy me. The best revenge was using their money to help women like I had been, so that no mother would ever have to face what I had faced alone. James would have been proud. But more importantly, my boys would grow up knowing that their mother had the strength to choose justice over vengeance, growth over destruction, hope over hatred. The Sterling family name would recover eventually. Money and time heal most public scandals, and they had enough of both to survive their disgrace. But they would never again be able to look at a woman like me and assume she was powerless. And that, I thought as I read the morning papers in my beautiful new home with my happy, healthy children, was justice enough. 2 years after the charity gala that destroyed the Sterling family's reputation, I stood in the boardroom of Sterling Industries, watching my sons play in the corner, while I reviewed quarterly reports that showed record-breaking profits and unprecedented employee satisfaction. Marcus was building something elaborate with blocks, David was reading a picture book about brave princesses, and Jonathan was drawing what he claimed was a portrait of our family, me, him, his brothers, and a tall figure he'd labeled Daddy watching from heaven. The Sterling family had indeed survived their public disgrace, but just barely. Victoria now worked as a volunteer coordinator for a homeless shelter, spending her days serving the kind of people she'd once dismissed as unworthy. Richard had taken a job as a mid-level manager at a manufacturing company, learning for the first time in his life what it meant to answer to someone else. Catherine had moved to another state entirely, apparently unable to face the daily reminders of her fall from grace. They'd kept their promise about staying away from my children, though I suspected that had more to do with shame than honor. The boys occasionally asked about their Sterling grandparents, but without the constant influence trying to turn them against me, they seemed perfectly content with our life. And what a life it had become! Sterling Industries now employed over 3,000 people across 6 states, every single one earning a living wage with comprehensive benefits. We'd been named one of the best companies to work for in America 3 months running. The Sterling Foundation had helped over 2,000 families escape poverty, funded scholarships for 500 single mothers pursuing education, and established job training programs in 12 communities. But the success I was most proud of had nothing to do with business metrics. Mrs. Sterling? Margaret Chin knocked and entered with her usual efficiency, but her smile was warmer now than it had been in our early days. Dr. Williams is here for your lunch appointment. Dr. Marcus Williams, no relation to my Marcus, just one of those beautiful coincidences that made life feel intentional, had entered our lives 8 months ago when the Sterling Foundation partnered with the Children's Hospital, where he worked as a pediatric surgeon. He'd been consulting on our initiative to provide free medical care for low-income families when I'd mentioned my boys' upcoming checkups. I could take a look at them. He'd offered with the kind of genuine warmth I'd forgotten existed in men. I know how busy you must be, and house calls are something I actually enjoy. That house call had turned into dinner, which had turned into long conversations about everything from child development to social justice to the challenges of building a life after loss. Marcus, Dr. Williams, had lost his wife 3 years earlier to cancer, and he understood both the weight of raising children alone and the complicated process of learning to trust love again. "Should I tell him you'll be right there?" Margaret asked, pulling me back to the present. "Actually, send him in. The boys have been asking about him all morning." Marcus Williams walked into the boardroom with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in any environment. He was tall, kind-eyed, and had the rare gift of being able to talk to 3-year-olds like they were fascinating people rather than small inconveniences. "Dr. Marcus." Jonathan shouted, abandoning his drawing to run over for a hug. "Uncle Marcus." David corrected, which had become his preferred title for the man who'd been patiently earning their trust for months. "Hey there, future presidents," Marcus said, scooping up Jonathan while David showed him the book he'd been reading. "What are we building today, Architect Marcus?" Young Marcus held up his block creation proudly. "It's a hospital like yours, but bigger." And it has a playground on the roof because kids should have fun when they're getting better. That's the best hospital design I've ever seen, Dr. Marcus said seriously. When you're old enough, I hope you'll help me build one just like it. Watching this man interact with my children with such genuine affection never failed to move me. He wasn't trying to replace their father or win them over with expensive gifts. He was simply showing up consistently and kindly, letting them set the pace of acceptance. "Boys," I said, "Dr. Marcus and I are going to lunch. Mrs. Chin will stay with you, and when we get back, we have a surprise to discuss." The surprise was something Marcus and I had been planning for weeks. Sterling Industries was funding the construction of a new children's wing at the hospital, designed specifically with input from young patients about what would make medical treatment less scary and more hopeful. It would be state-of-the-art medical facilities combined with play areas, art therapy rooms, and family spaces that recognized healing happened better when children felt safe and loved. Over lunch at a quiet restaurant downtown, Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. "I have something I want to discuss with you," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant serious conversation ahead. "The hospital project?" "Actually, something more personal." He smiled, but I could see nervousness in his eyes. "Amara, these past 8 months have been the happiest I've been since Sarah died. Not just because of you, though you're incredible, but because of the life we're building together. The boys feel like family to me, and I hope I'm starting to feel like family to them." My heart started beating faster. This conversation felt significant in a way that made me both excited and terrified. "You are family to us, Marcus. You know that." "Good. Because I'd like to make it official." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know this might seem fast to some people, but when you've learned how quickly life can change, you don't waste time when you find something beautiful." The ring was perfect, not the massive diamond that screamed wealth, but an elegant solitaire that spoke of thoughtful choice and lasting love. "Amara Sterling, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and helping you raise those 3 amazing boys?" I stared at the ring, thinking about how far I'd traveled from the broken woman clutching $12 and 3 crying babies. 2 years ago, I'd thought my life was over. Now I was being offered a new beginning with a man who saw my strength instead of my scars, who loved my children as deeply as he loved me. "Yes," I whispered, then louder. "Yes, absolutely yes." The proposal made the local society pages, which amused me more than it should have. "Sterling Industries CEO engaged to prominent surgeon," read the headline. 2 years ago, I would have been described as James Sterling's widow. Now, I was news in my own right. The wedding was small and perfect, held in the garden of our new home with just family and close friends. The boys served as ring bearers, walking down the aisle with serious expressions and careful steps. Margaret Chin cried through the entire ceremony. Governor Matthews officiated, having become a genuine friend after witnessing my public vindication at the charity gala. Marcus's parents flew in from Chicago, gracious people who welcomed me and the boys with the kind of warmth I'd once thought only existed in movies. They understood loss, having buried their daughter-in-law, and they understood love, having watched their son slowly heal from grief. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the reception, when young Marcus tugged on Dr. Marcus's jacket and asked, "Are you going to be our new daddy?" Marcus knelt down to eye level with my son and said, "I'm going to be your stepdad, which means I'll love you and take care of you just like a daddy would. But you'll always have your real daddy in your heart, and I'll make sure you never forget how much he loved you." "Okay," Marcus said seriously. "But can we still call you Uncle Marcus sometimes?" "You can call me whatever makes you happy, buddy." "Then I'll call you Dad Marcus, because you're both now." From the mouths of babes. The Sterling Foundation's annual gala, we'd kept the tradition but transformed its meaning entirely, happened 6 months later. This time, the event celebrated achievements of single mothers who'd used our scholarship programs to build better lives. Instead of wealthy people congratulating themselves on their generosity, we highlighted the women who'd overcome impossible obstacles to create opportunities for their children. Standing at the podium in the same ballroom where I'd exposed the Sterling family's cruelty, I looked out at an audience that included former scholarship recipients who are now nurses, teachers, lawyers, and business owners. Women who'd been exactly where I was 2 years ago, broken, desperate, certain their lives were over. 2 years ago, I stood on this same stage and told you about the power of truth, the importance of justice, and the possibility of redemption. Tonight, I want to talk about the power of hope. I gestured to the women scattered throughout the audience, wearing special pins that identified them as Sterling Foundation success stories. Every woman wearing a gold pin tonight was once told she couldn't succeed, that she wasn't smart enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to build a better life. They were told that single mothers don't become doctors, that women from poor backgrounds don't start successful businesses, that people like them don't get happy endings. The applause was immediate and sustained. But they proved those voices wrong. Not through magic or luck, but through hard work, determination, and the kind of community support that recognizes potential instead of focusing on past mistakes. I found Dr. Marcus in the audience, sitting with my boys who were dressed in tiny tuxedos and trying to stay awake past their bedtime. Jonathan waved at me from his stepdad's lap, and I had to pause to collect myself. The Sterling Foundation exists because I learned that the best way to heal from cruelty is to prevent others from experiencing that same cruelty. The best way to recover from injustice is to create more justice in the world. The best way to move past your own pain is to ensure that pain serves a purpose. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. But more importantly, I watched several audience members approach the scholarship recipients afterward, offering job opportunities, mentorship, and business partnerships. Hope, it turned out, was not only healing, it was contagious. Later that night, after the boys were tucked into bed in our house that felt like a real home instead of a museum, Marcus and I sat on our back porch looking at stars that seemed brighter than they used to be. "Any regrets?" he asked, the way he sometimes did when we talked about the journey that had brought us together.
About what?
Showing mercy to the Sterling family. You could have destroyed them completely. I thought about Victoria Sterling, who now spent her days helping homeless families find shelter and job training. About Richard Sterling, who'd apparently become an advocate for workers' rights at his new company. About Catherine Sterling, who'd started a nonprofit in her new city focused on anti-racism education. They're not the same people they were 2 years ago, I said finally. Losing everything they valued forced them to find new ways to matter. Maybe that's what they needed all along. And if they'd chosen differently, if they'd learned nothing from their fall, then the consequences would have been their choice, not mine. I can only control my own actions, my own choices about who I want to be. Marcus pulled me closer, and we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood where our children played safely, where neighbors knew our names, where we'd built the kind of life James had dreamed of for us. "The boys asked me today if we could have a baby sister," Marcus said eventually. "Did they now? And what did you tell them?" I told them that was a conversation for grown-ups to have when they're ready for it. I smiled, thinking about how full our life already was, but also about how much love we still had to give. "Well," I said, "when those grown-ups are ready for that conversation, I think they might find they're very interested in adding to this family." "Really? Really? This house is pretty big, and our hearts are even bigger." As we headed inside, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the broken widow who'd once clutched $12 like a lifeline. This woman stood tall, smiled easily, and radiated the kind of confidence that comes from surviving the worst and choosing to build something beautiful from the ashes. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chin. Tomorrow's board meeting moved to 2 p.m. Also, Forbes wants to do a feature on female CEOs who've transformed family businesses. Are you interested? 2 years ago, I would have been terrified by the attention. Now I was intrigued by the opportunity to share our story with other women who might need to hear that impossible situations can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Very interested, I texted back. Before turning off the lights, I checked on my boys one final time. Marcus was sprawled across his bed like a starfish, completely relaxed in sleep. David had arranged his stuffed animals in precise rows, even his dreams organized and thoughtful. Jonathan clutched a book about knights and dragons, already dreaming of heroes and adventures. They would grow up knowing their mother as a woman who'd owned companies and changed lives, not as someone who'd once been counted out and written off. They would understand that strength comes from choosing hope over bitterness, justice over revenge, growth over destruction. Most importantly, they would know that love, real love, shows up in actions, not just words. That the people who truly care about you prove it by protecting you, supporting you, and believing in your worth even when you can't see it yourself. I hope this story has reminded you that your current circumstances don't define your future possibilities. That mercy can be more powerful than revenge, that justice is more satisfying than vengeance, and that the best way to heal from cruelty is to create more kindness in the world. Whether you're dealing with your own impossible situation or you're in a position to help someone else through theirs, remember that transformation is always possible. People can change, systems can improve, and hope can bloom in the most unlikely places. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about real people overcoming impossible odds. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength and worth. And tell me in the comments, what's one way you've turned a painful experience into something that helps others? Because that's what we're all here for, to remind each other that no matter how dark things get, morning always comes. And sometimes, that morning brings possibilities more beautiful than anything we could have imagined. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for believing that broken things can be made whole, that lost people can find their way, and that love really does win in the end. Until next time, remember, you are stronger than you know, more valuable than anyone has ever told you, and capable of things that would amaze the people who've underestimated you. Your story isn't over. In fact, it might just be beginning.